All right, so we left off discussing the Olmec, the Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca. Remember, the Olmec predate the Maya. Now, most of you guys, we talked a bit about the archaeology last class. In your lifetime, around 2007, 2008, archaeologists have been able to find more connections that link the Olmec and the Mayan. But the Olmec predated the Mayan predated the Aztec. And if you want to kind of look at the Inca are like basically rising to power at around the time of the decline of the Maya, and at the height of the power of the Aztec and the Inca, that's happening simultaneously. All right. Much of the culture of the Maya, the Olmec, and the Aztec are similar. The Inca is quite different, but what's also interesting is that there are similar gods in all of these cultures to gods that are in this culture. So we'll talk more about that as we move forward. I don't know if you've ever seen the Olmec heads before. There are 17 Olmec heads that have been unearthed. This is one of those like bucket list items for me. I really like to get to La Venta and San Lorenzo to be able to see these with my own eyes. These were discovered in the 1960s and 70s, and more have been unearthed. And over the course of the last 60, 70 years, more artifacts have been discovered connected to the Olmec civilizations. And obviously this sort of goes through Mexico and down into Honduras and El Salvador and Belize. It also sort of overlaps and connects to where artifacts have been found in temples and ruins for the Maya. Pretty cool, huh? Amazing. The Mayan, we talked about the Mayan alphabet, the land alphabet, that was really a codex, or it was decoded by a Spaniard named Diego de Landa. This sort of Rosetta Stone for the Maya was ultimately saved after World War II. This has allowed researchers, archaeologists, historians, and scientists to be able to break the code of the Mayan script. We also, in your lifetime and in mine, have been able to find themes that in these written hieroglyphs that connect Olmec to Mayan and Mayan to Aztec. One really great example is the calendar. This is an Aztec calendar, but the Mayan calendar and the Aztec calendar share a whole lot of similarities. This is a really important god in the Mayan culture. This little guy here, his name is Choc. A lot of people were sacrificed, and most people that were sacrificed in the Mayan culture were enemies of the Mayan. And this little guy here is the god of rain. So, a very important god in the Mayan culture. And then this was Chichen Itza. Chichen Itza was host to sort of a little bit of everything. It was religious. It was commercial. There was a lot of commerce that was happening. It's sort of central in the Yucatan. This temple, as I previously mentioned, was built in honor of Kukulkan. And it's truly amazing when you see this temple on the solstice. That's something that I'm going to share with you guys so you can see what this temple looks like to honor Kukulkan on the solstice. Any questions about the Maya out there? All right, cool. And then The Aztec will rise to great heights after the collapse of the Maya. Most historians believe that the collapse of the Olmec and the collapse of the Maya, and really most civilizations that collapse, it occurs for a variety of reasons, right? You've got drought, you've got famine, you've got warfare, and then, of course, what's one of those other factors, especially brought over by Europeans? Disease, right? We know we have a decent idea that the Olmec and the Mayan likely collapsed due to drought and famine and war, but we know without a doubt that the collapse of the Aztec occurred, as a result of disease and warfare. This was the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, with chinampas or floating gardens that were built in and around Lake Texcoco. This city rivaled London and Rome at its height. This was basically the dominant sort of city center of central Mexico. Not the Yucatan, but central Mexico. The Aztecs' rise to power occurred from the 1300s to the 1500s. Their decline begins in the early 1500s because disease arrived at their doorstep before the arrival of the Spanish. Does anybody know the conquistador that took down the Aztec? You guys ever heard of Hernan Cortez? Very good. Excellent. Hernan Cortez is going to be the one that takes down the Aztec. We're going to be talking about this later because the Cortez's conquest is going to be one of our case studies, because what Cortez will do is sort of write the how-to guide, the conquistador's guide for dummies on how to overthrow a major empire. So we'll get to that a bit later. The tribe often referred to themselves as Mexica. They had a rich mythological culture, hundreds of gods. They were a warring people, and a warring people will create what around them? Many, many what? What will warlike people create all around them? Enemies, right? And death and destruction. This worked in favor of the Spaniards because at the decline of the Aztec Empire, many of their neighbors were unifying to try to go to war against them. And again, we'll talk more about this as we move on. Tenochtitlan, absolutely stunning. The temples, you have trash collection, you have a labor system. It's sort of similar to the Inca. Somebody asked yesterday, did they was there a system of slavery? There was, but it was actually more kind of like indentured servitude rather than chattel slavery, where you have these sort of servitude kind of like for a fixed period of time, as opposed to servitude for life. Really, the rules of conquest in Europe were similar in the Americas. If a tribe conquered another, there were basically 3 rules of engagement. Those who were conquered were either killed, absorbed, or enslaved. So often when we see these human sacrifices that were carried out by the Mayan and the Aztec, the people that they were sacrificing were typically their enemies. All right? So, lastly, we're looking in Mesoamerica at the Inca. What we have going on up here, this is a reenactment of the last Incan emperor. His name is Atahualpa. We'll talk more about him as we move forward. Do you guys know the conquistador that will overthrow the Inca and Atahualpa?
Is it Pizarro?
Very good. It's Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro, we're going to discuss him later in the lesson. Excellent job earlier. You guys nailed this one. That's Machu Picchu. But really, the main Incan center for life and commerce was Cusco. Over here on the left, we have the Quipu. This is their system of keeping records and history and communicating. That will create a clash of cultures when the Spaniards arrive, because the Spaniards have movable type, the Incans do not, and that's going to create some real big problems in relation to religion. So, any questions up to this point? You guys good? All right. So now we're moving to advanced New World cultures in North America. Obviously, the Aztec were in North America, but what I'm mainly looking at is what is now the continental United States. So, excellent job earlier. Somebody brought up the Pueblo tribe. The Pueblo tribe is not just one tribe. The Pueblo are a group of like 7 different tribes that would have existed out in present-day Arizona and New Mexico. They controlled and dominated the Rio Grande and also the Colorado River Valley and the area that we now know as the Grand Canyon, right? Anybody been to the Grand Canyon? Life-changing trip, all right? So you can actually still go along the Colorado and see evidence of their artwork along the canyon walls, along the Colorado River. They developed intricate irrigation systems. These are irrigation systems that are still in use today. They were really big on salt mining, because what could you use your salt to do? Preserve your food, right? Notably meat. So they were hunters as well. They built elaborate dwellings. Some of them were built out of cliffs. For example, the site of Mesa Verde, which is one of the oldest inhabited sites in North America. We also have Chaco, which was a religious center and a commercial center. Chaco is absolutely amazing. It's in New Mexico. Has anyone ever seen Chaco before? All right, I'm going to share that with you guys. A lot of natives in the region still make pilgrimages to Chaco, even to this day. They also made really sophisticated adobe dwellings that had multiple levels for multiple families to live. They would dig out basements to preserve squash and beans and corn and other agricultural goods. And they would build rooms in the top of adobe homes or in the top of cliff dwelling homes in order to be able to smoke and preserve meats. So they were quite good at food preservation. Now we move down to the southeast. Now this is often referred, it's kind of a little tricky, but this is often referred to as the lower Mississippian. And there are a lot of different tribes down here, but there are 3 tribes I'm kind of highlighting: the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Cherokee. You've got the Appalachee and the Alabama and the Mobile and a host of others. But the 3 that I'm looking at really dominated this region of the southeast in the southern portion of the Appalachian Mountain Range. They created advanced farming techniques. They used crop rotation. They used clear cutting and slash and burn techniques that were handed off and carried on to other tribes and eventually to settlers that would arrive from Europe. A lot of tribal hunting. You brought up growing up in southern Appalachia, you can still hike these trails that these tribes carved out for hunting thousands of years ago. You have a network of trade routes The interesting thing about their trade routes is that their trade routes went from really like the border of present day Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, all the way up to present day West Virginia, Virginia, and into the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley is pretty interesting because, and we're going to talk more about the Shenandoah Valley later. The Shenandoah Valley was host to numerous tribes that moved through hunting, farming, and trading. We'll talk a bit more about Appalachia as we move into the colonial period. Obviously, Appalachia was rich in resources. It's our oldest mountain range in North America. It's still rich in resources. This was a reason that a lot of tribes were lured to the plateaus and the valleys of Appalachia. The Iroquois, excellent job bringing them up. They are one of our really important tribes that will stay with us really through the first half of the semester. The Iroquois dominated what is now upstate New York and throughout pretty much to the west of like western New York along Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, and to the east, the headwaters of, the headwaters of the Hudson River Valley. The Iroquois came together. They were a group of 5 tribes, later 6. They were made up of the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Oneida, the Cayuga, and the Onondaga. The 6th tribe that joins later will be the Tuscarora. If you take a look here, that's the Iroquois Confederacy's symbol right here. Now, they didn't have like a flag. What they used was what was called wampum. We see a lot of these tribes use wampum. Have you ever heard of wampum before? Wampum is basically like the use of shells and beads to create sort of almost like a flag or a sash, and they used wampum to keep their history. They used wampum to keep their records and tell their stories. It's kind of like what the Inca did with the quipu. We're going to talk more about wampum as we move forward because wampum was really important in these societies. What brought this group together was a common enemy, and that was the Algonquian and the Huron. The Algonquian, as previously mentioned, pretty much stretched from the Carolinas all the way up to New England, and the Huron dominated much of the area of Canada, present-day Canada, around the Great Lakes, and also kind of dipping into New England as well. We're going to learn a lot more about them in more depth. This is one of the most successful political and military alliances in North America. I would put it like in the same sort of group as what the Cherokee did. Cherokee's a little bit different. The Cherokee basically had sort of what we would consider like a bicameral government. There was a peace government and a war government in the Cherokee civilization, but in the Iroquois civilization, these 5 tribes basically lived by a constitution known as the Great Law of Peace. And we don't give them as much credit as we should, and I am very deliberate in this class to give them the credit they deserve, because a lot of the principles that exist in our government today, and I know that representative governments were created in America during the colonial period, but when we get to like the founding of the new nation with the Articles of Confederation and the U.S. Constitution, some of our founders, people like Ben Franklin, are going to pull some of the ideas of the Great Law of Peace into the development of the Articles and later the Constitution, which I think is pretty amazing. Women held a great deal of power in the Iroquois Confederacy. If you think about your mom's side of the family, Well, that was the dominant side of the family in the Longhouse Iroquois culture. Where are my lacrosse players at? I know you're out there. That's what the Iroquois used to train their warriors, notably the Mohawk. We'll talk more about the game of lacrosse as we move forward. It's kind of like the game of Pocatawk for the Olmec and the Maya. Then we move to the Plains Indians, notably the Sioux, the Pawnee, the Omaha, the Lakota. There are a whole lot of tribes out here that existed in the plains. Another tribe that was really powerful out here was the Mandan. We'll talk more about them when we get to our Lewis and Clark lesson, or to that portion of our lesson later in the semester. They hunted buffalo herds. They lived in a nomadic lifestyle. They typically, many of them lived in teepees so they could move around. But I do want to let you all know, not all of your plains natives lived in teepees. A number of them lived in wigwams or other styles of dwellings, because a lot of them would actually establish like winter encampments. Over time, once horses were introduced, as well as more farming techniques, a lot of those native tribes in the plains started to use horses to hunt as an advantage, and they also used more advanced agriculture. So you start to see less of a nomadic lifestyle and more of a permanent type of dwelling in those regions. And then lastly, the mound and wigwam builders. We often refer to this group as your middle or central Mississippian cultures. And these are a lot, okay? The Adena, the Hopewell, the Miami, the Shawnee, the Mississippian. Also other tribes that you may have heard of, the Sauk, the Fox, the Kickapoo, and I know everyone's heard of this one, the Blackhawk, right? These tribes controlled the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, and much of the land that they inhabited was quite marshy, and this lent itself to large-scale agriculture, which then lent itself to the development of large-scale civilizations popping up in the Mississippi River Valley. The most stunning and amazing of them all was Cahokia. In fact, other than like Tikal in the Mayan world, or Cusco in the Incan world, or Tenochtitlan in the Aztec world, Cahokia was the largest inhabited city center that existed in the continental United States that's ever been discovered. These were large mounds outside of St. Louis. This is where the Mississippi and the Missouri kind of converge. And it is believed that as many as 30,000 people inhabited Cahokia at its height. We're going to take a look at that. Has anyone ever been to Cahokia before? All right, that's also on my list. I'm trying to get to Cahokia one of these days. It's located in Illinois, right across the Mississippi from St. Louis, Missouri. How cool is that? Chaco. Chaco is a spiritual and commercial center that was built by the Pueblo. And this is Cahokia. Cahokia was these mounds and dwellings built all around the mounds. The mounds were used for religious and burial purposes. These mounds were not discovered, though, until after the Lewis and Clark expedition. More explorers after Lewis and Clark and would-be settlers start moving out. And Cahokia was discovered in like 1811 by American settlers moving west. And this is one of the largest mounds at Cahokia in Illinois. I don't know when I'm going to get there, but it's going to happen one of these days. Any questions up to this point? Yeah.
There's like tribes out in New Mexico or like the deserts like that. How do they get fresh water?
There were aquifers that were under like parts of the land out there that they would use those aquifers to help with their irrigation as well. You also had freshwater sources that rolled through various river valleys, and tributaries that came off the Colorado River as well. Yep. All right. So this is where we're going to wrap things up today. That sound good to everybody? Visual evidence of indirect discoverers of the New World. So most of the time, if we were just to ask anybody on the street and we were to say, who was the first person to arrive in the New World, they would immediately say, who? Columbus, right? But there are others who arrived well before Columbus. And there is a professor from Harvard who has since passed, Dr. Lowen, who gave much of his life to the scholarship of indirect discovery. There are also other research teams all over the world and in America who have dedicated their academic scholarship to indirect discoverers. So I feel like I need to give a little love to our indirect discoverers, the people and the would-be explorers who beat Columbus to the New World. So the first group are our West African explorers from Mandé and Mali. Prairie View College down in Texas, historically, it's an HBCU, historical Black college and university. They have dedicated a great deal of time to the research behind the Mandé and the explorers from Mali. The earliest that we believe that African explorers would have likely arrived in the New World, we believe that the Mandé would have interacted with the Olmec at San Lorenzo and La Venta. And the more recent, about 200 years prior to the arrival of Columbus, the explorers from Mali would have likely arrived in the Caribbean because upon the arrival of Columbus, numerous members of the Arawak and the Taino, the tribes that Columbus interacted with and ultimately horrifically devastated and inflicted genocide upon, would tell of stories of African explorers who came before Columbus, and there's been golden spears that have been found. There were different types of trade goods that connected to Africa. Again, great deal of scholarship related to this. There have been books written on the topic. There have been historical papers that have been published. There's also numerous YouTube videos, if you ever wanted to jump down that rabbit hole, related to the West African explorers of Mandé and Mali. One of the most remarkable journeys was a 1,000-ship exploration out of Mali across the Atlantic, which is pretty insane if you think about it. To the right, we have St. Brendan, the legend of St. Brendan in the Norse sagas was written. He was an Irish monk and explorer. We know without a doubt Brendan explored from Ireland to Greenland, or to Iceland and to Greenland, but we also believe Brendan may have made it all the way to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, which is north of Maine in Canada, and may have explored all the way into the Caribbean. All right? Do I have any Catholics in the house? All right? Catholics out there, St. Brendan is the patron saint of sailors. So there's another example of an indirect explorer. This is one that is pretty amazing. This is a World Heritage Site, Norstead, or sorry, French students, I'm just gonna go and tell you, my French is not good. No. Lawns, Meadows. Did I do okay? No French students in the house? Did I do all right? Lawns, Meadows. Yay! All right. So, in the 60s, a Viking village was discovered at Lawns on Meadows, aka Norstead, and it is now a World Heritage Site. A very famous Viking. Well, as you guys already know, the Vikings had made it to Iceland and Greenland, right? And established settlements. They decide to venture farther west and arrive in present-day Newfoundland at this location, where they established settlements and sod houses. And you know what I mean by sod houses? These are like houses that are just made of like bricks of soil. And they established a blacksmith shop and a fishing center, and they had you ever played Civilization before? Anybody? Just me? Sorry, I'm a bit nerdy. I like that game. They're like building their own little, settlement. But things start to spiral a little bit. There's a very famous Viking that led this expedition. Has anyone ever heard of Leif Erikson before? All right, cool. Son of Eric the Red. He led this expedition. But things get a little dicey because who's already here? Natives, right? So they start to tangle with the local natives, and things don't go well. They're also very far separated from, even Greenland and Iceland, they're a ways away, so they give up the enterprise and head out. This is an interesting connector, though. There are, part of the Norse sagas, there are claims that when they arrived in Newfoundland, there were Irish monks that were left behind by St. Brendan, but we don't have firm evidence for that. That pops up in the Norse sagas. Polynesians, this is without a doubt Chile, Peru in the 700s. How do we know this? Well, thanks to carbon dating and archaeology, there have been Polynesian chicken bones and fish hooks that have been found. Are y'all familiar with the Kentucky? All right. You guys realize how much of the Pacific the Polynesians traversed, right? We're talking about a massive chunk of the globe that the Polynesians moved around and dominated, and islands that they settled, and eventually they make their way so far east that they land Chile, Peru. In your lifetime, this has been remarkable. There have been DNA and genome research on the DNA of natives in Central and South America and the DNA of Polynesians. And there are DNA markers that go all the way back to Colombia during this period of time that would connect Colombian indigenous people and Polynesian indigenous people on a genome and DNA research, which I think is pretty cool. And then, of course, Zheng He. You guys familiar with Zheng He? The great Chinese explorer who basically had a floating city that traveled throughout the Pacific and eventually made it to the West Coast well before the arrival of Columbus. So these are some of our indirect explorers. We have one of the colossal Olmec heads. We have St. Brendan. This is Norstead. That's the dwellings that the Vikings lived in. Polynesian explorers, and there is Shanghai. That's all I've got for you today. Comments, questions, concerns? All right, did you guys find that interesting? Learn a little something today? That's what I'm talking about. All right, cool. So, I am going to move right along